You're a young mother in 1453 Constantinople. The great walls that have protected your city for over 1,000 years are crumbling under Ottoman cannons. Your husband died defending the ramparts 3 days ago. Now Turkish soldiers are breaking down your door, and you're holding your infant daughter, knowing that what comes next will make his death seem like a blessing. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire conquered territories spanning 3 continents. From the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, we remember them for architectural marvels like the Blue Mosque, for brilliant military tactics for sultans who shaped the course of history. But there's another side to Ottoman expansion that historians have largely buried in dusty archives, a systematic approach to conquest that weaponized the most intimate aspects of human existence. Before we continue, if you find this type of forgotten history compelling, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It genuinely helps us create more content like this. Now, let's examine what really happened when Ottoman forces achieved victory. The moment an Ottoman army broke through enemy defenses, a carefully orchestrated process began that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with systematic exploitation. This wasn't chaos or the uncontrolled violence of battle. This was policy implemented with bureaucratic precision across hundreds of conquered cities and towns. When Constantinople finally fell on May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed's forces didn't simply loot and withdraw. They implemented what Ottoman military manuals called the harvesting protocol. Contemporary Byzantine chroniclers describe scenes that sound like something from nightmares. But Ottoman records treat these same events as routine administrative procedures. The protocol was ruthlessly efficient. Adult males over 12 were systematically executed, not in the heat of battle, but in organized groups after surrender. This wasn't about eliminating military threats. Boys as young as 6 were also killed if they showed signs of potential resistance. The Ottomans had learned that leaving male survivors, even children, created future problems, but death was reserved for males. Women and young girls faced something far worse. Ottoman military law codified in documents that survive in Turkish archives today established clear procedures for what they termed population processing. Women were immediately separated into categories based on age, physical condition, and perceived value. The sorting happened in public squares, often in front of burning churches or demolished civic buildings, ensuring maximum psychological impact on both victims and any remaining population. Young women between roughly 14 and 25 comprised the most valuable category. Ottoman records from the Constantinople conquest list 42 women in this group, each assigned a numerical designation and estimated market value. These weren't abstract statistics. They were human beings reduced to inventory items in ledgers that treated them like livestock. The second category included women between 25 and 40 considered suitable for manual labor but past their prime for other purposes. The third category, women over 40, faced immediate execution alongside the men, deemed too old to justify the expense of feeding and transporting. Children presented a special opportunity. Boys under 6 were taken for the Dave Sherman system, the empire's systematic program of cultural and religious conversion, but girls under 12 entered what Ottoman documents euphemistically called formation programs designed to prepare them for specific roles within the imperial hierarchy. The psychological warfare embedded in these procedures was as carefully planned as any military campaign. Families were forced to watch the sorting process, mothers seeing daughters assigned to different categories, knowing they would never see them again. The Ottomans understood that this psychological trauma would spread throughout remaining populations, making future resistance less likely. Contemporary accounts describe how Ottoman soldiers would deliberately separate mothers from infant children, not for practical reasons, but to maximize emotional distress. Crying babies were often killed immediately, not out of cruelty toward the infants, but to demonstrate complete power over their mothers. The message was clear. Resistance meant watching your children die. The scale of what happened in Constantinople provides a template for understanding Ottoman conquest patterns across their empire. Within 48 hours of the city's fall, approximately 50,000 people had been processed through these categories. 12,000 women and girls were loaded onto ships destined for slave markets in Bura, Ankara, and other Ottoman cities. Another 8,000 were distributed among the conquering army as personal property. But the systematic nature of Ottoman practices becomes truly horrifying when we examine their documentation methods. The empire maintained detailed records because these weren't spontaneous war crimes. They were planned economic activities that required careful accounting. Ships manifests from the period list human cargo alongside silk, spices, and precious metals. A typical entry might read 20 bolts Damascus, silk, 40 pepper, 15 females aged 16 to 20 years, excellent condition. The women weren't even granted the dignity of names in these documents, just ages, physical descriptions, and estimated values. The economic infrastructure supporting the system stretched across the entire Ottoman Empire. Specialized markets in major cities had dedicated sections for human trafficking with established pricing. Structures that fluctuated based on supply and demand. A young Greek or Serbian woman might command 20 to 30 silver pieces in Istanbul markets, while African women brought different prices depending on their origins and physical characteristics. The Ottomans didn't invent slavery, but they industrialized it in ways that previous empires had never achieved. They created standardized procedures for capture, transport, and sale that operated with the efficiency of modern corporations. Bills of sale, transport receipts, and market inventories survive in Ottoman archives, documenting human misery with the same attention to detail applied to any other commercial enterprise. Perhaps most disturbing was how this system created its own momentum. Success in Ottoman military campaigns was measured not just in territory conquered, but in people captured. Commanders received bonuses based on the number and quality of prisoners taken. This created incentives for targeting civilian populations rather than just military forces. The psychological impact on surviving populations was precisely what Ottoman strategists intended. Villages and cities that witnessed these processing procedures often surrendered without resistance. When Ottoman armies appeared on the horizon, the empire's reputation for systematic brutality became a weapon more effective than cannons or cavalry charges. Women who survived the initial sorting faced journeys to various destinations throughout the empire, each carrying its own specific horrors. Those destined for slave markets traveled in specially constructed ships with cargo holds designed for human transport. Maritime archaeological evidence reveals ventilation systems, water storage, and waste management designed to keep human cargo alive during weeks-long voyages. The ships were floating prisons, but they were also laboratories for systematic dehumanization. Women were stripped of clothing, names, and any personal possessions that might remind them of their previous lives. They were given numbers and basic garments that marked their status as property. The process was designed to break psychological reach resistance before their final destinations. Ottoman records indicate mortality rates during transport averaged around 15%. Considered acceptable losses by administrators who viewed human cargo through purely economic calculations. Women who died during transport were simply thrown overboard, their deaths recorded in ledgers alongside spoiled grain or damaged goods. The empire's approach to conquered women reveals a level of systematic planning that challenges everything we think we know about medieval warfare. This wasn't mindless brutality or cultural misunderstanding. This was deliberate policy implemented across centuries and continents designed to transform human beings into commodities while simultaneously terrorizing entire populations into submission. But the true horror wasn't just in what happened during conquest. It was in what came afterward, when the systematic exploitation of women became the foundation of Ottoman imperial administration. The empire's legal framework transformed rape into marriage, murder into justice, and slavery into divine mandate. Ottoman legal codes preserved in archives across Turkey spell out procedures that legalized every form of sexual violence imaginable. These weren't aberrations or violations of law, they were the law. The concept of war wives became central to Ottoman expansion strategy. When a warrior died in battle against Ottoman forces, his widow automatically became property of whoever killed him. This wasn't informal tradition. It was codified legal doctrine with specific procedures for claiming ownership. The claiming process required 3 witnesses and had to occur within 72 hours of the husband's death. After that window, other warriors could challenge ownership, leading to fights over women like disputes over livestock. Ottoman military courts maintained detailed records of these ownership battles, treating them as standard property disputes. But legal ownership was just the beginning. The transformation of conquered women into war wives required systematic destruction of their previous identities. Names were changed immediately, often to Turkish versions that bore no resemblance to their birth names. Religious conversion was mandatory, enforced through procedures that combined psychological torture with religious instruction. The conversion process involved public ceremonies where women were forced to denounce their previous faith, often required to spit on religious symbols or burn sacred texts from their former lives. Those who refused faced escalating punishments designed to break resistance without reducing their market value. The empire maintained conversion centers in major cities, facilities designed specifically for processing conquered women. Archaeological excavations at sites in Bursa and Adrianople have revealed building foundations with specialized chambers, drainage systems, and restraint mechanisms that paint a picture of industrial psychological warfare. These centers operated for decades, processing thousands of women through standardized programs designed to erase cultural memory and replace it with complete subservience. The programs typically lasted 6 months, long enough to ensure pregnancy from systematic rape, creating biological bonds that made escape psychologically impossible. Children born from these forced unions faced their own systematic exploitation. Mixed blood offspring were often killed immediately if they showed signs of resembling their mothers too closely, seen as inconvenient evidence of the rape that created them. Survivors were raised to serve the empire, never knowing their mothers' real names or original cultures. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual victims to entire populations. The Ottomans deliberately publicized their treatment of conquered women, spreading detailed accounts through territories they planned to invade. The reputation for systematic sexual violence became a weapon of conquest more effective than any military technology. Villagers would surrender without fighting rather than subject their women to documented Ottoman procedures. The empire's own chroniclers wrote proudly of cities that capitulated immediately upon hearing what had happened to women in previously conquered territories. Fear became their most effective military asset, but surrender offered no protection. The Ottomans had learned that terrorized populations were easier to control than grateful ones. Even cities that submitted voluntarily often found their women subjected to the same systematic exploitation, justified as necessary for imperial security. The tribute system formalized this exploitation on a massive scale. The famous Devsh levy that took boys also included systematic collection of girls, though this aspect receives far less historical attention. Young girls were taken from Christian families under the same legal framework used for boys, but their destination and treatment differed dramatically. While boys might eventually rise to positions of power within Ottoman administration, girls disappeared into systems designed for sexual exploitation and reproductive slavery. Ottoman records indicate that approximately 40% of girls taken in tribute levies died within their first year of captivity, victims of systematic abuse that their captives documented with bureaucratic precision. The survivors faced lives of controlled breeding managed like agricultural livestock to produce children for the empire. These breeding programs operated in facilities across Ottoman territory with detailed records tracking pregnancy rates, infant mortality, and the productive lifespan of female captives. The empire's approach to female captives reveals mathematical calculations of human misery that defy comprehension. Ottoman administrators calculated the optimal age for capturing girls, the most efficient methods for breaking psychological resistance, and the precise balance between exploitation and survival necessary to maintain productive breeding populations. These calculations appear in administrative documents that treat human suffering as engineering problems requiring technical solutions. The cold precision of these records, the matter-of-fact discussion of torture and rape, provides insight into how systematic dehumanization became normalized within imperial culture. The economic incentives driving this system created a feedback loop that intensified over time. Military commanders who captured valuable women received promotions and bonuses. Slave traders who supplied high-quality females gained preferential treatment in imperial contracts. The empire's entire military and administrative structure developed around the systematic exploitation of conquered populations. This wasn't limited to battlefield captures. Ottoman forces conducted regular raids into neighboring territories, specifically to acquire women and children for imperial use. These raids followed seasonal patterns, timed to maximize captures while minimizing military risk. Entire communities lived in constant terror of harvest-time raids that could destroy families overnight. The raids were planned with military precision using intelligence networks that identified the most valuable targets. Ottoman scouts would spend months mapping villages, identifying the most attractive women and healthiest children, planning routes that maximize captures while avoiding military confrontation. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of abduction shaped entire cultures. Parents would deliberately scar their daughters' faces or break their limbs to make them less desirable to Ottoman raiders. The empire had created societies where loving families felt compelled to harm their own children to protect them from worse fates. Some communities developed elaborate hiding systems, underground chambers and forest refuges where women and children could hide during raid seasons. But the Ottomans adapted their tactics, using torture to force villagers to reveal hiding places, turning survival strategies into death traps. The empire's systematic approach to sexual violence created cultural changes that persisted long after Ottoman power declined. Entire regions developed traditions and customs designed around protecting women from capture, social structures that assumed constant threat of abduction and systematic rape. These cultural adaptations provide evidence of the scale and persistence of Ottoman practices. When entire societies reorganize themselves around protecting women from systematic sexual violence, that violence has become a defining feature of their existence. The documentation of these practices exists because the Ottomans saw nothing shameful in their actions. They recorded their procedures with the same attention to detail they brought to tax collection or military planning, preserving evidence of systematic brutality that operated across centuries. The empire's record-keeping reveals something even more disturbing than individual atrocities. They maintained breeding registers, detailed logs tracking the reproductive capacity of enslaved women across their territories. These weren't crude tallies but sophisticated databases that monitored pregnancy cycles, birth outcomes, and the long-term productivity of what they termed their human livestock. Women who survived capture and transport found themselves assigned identification numbers and housed in facilities designed for maximum reproductive efficiency. Ottoman architects developed standardized building plans for these centers, structures that appeared throughout the empire with identical layouts optimized for controlling and monitoring female captives. The buildings featured small individual cells connected by corridors that allowed guards to monitor every movement. Central courtyards provided controlled exercise areas where women could maintain physical health necessary for childbearing. Specialized medical facilities ensured that pregnancies proceeded successfully, not out of concern for the women, but to protect imperial investments. Medical records from these facilities survive in Ottoman archives, documenting procedures that treated women like breeding animals. Physicians employed by the empire developed techniques for maximizing pregnancy rates and reducing infant mortality, innovations that served purely economic rather than humanitarian purposes. The empire's approach to managing these populations reveals industrial-level organization. Women were sorted by age, physical condition, and reproductive history. Those deemed most valuable for breeding received better food and medical care. Older women or those who failed to produce children faced transfer to manual labor facilities where conditions were deliberately harsh. The psychological manipulation employed in these centers was as systematic as the physical control. Women were told their families were dead, shown fabricated evidence of their home villages being destroyed. The goal was to eliminate hope of rescue or return, making resistance seem pointless. Ottoman administrators discovered that women who believed their previous lives had been completely erased were more compliant and less likely to attempt escape. The empire invested significant resources in creating and maintaining these psychological fictions, understanding that mental control was more effective than physical restraints. The children born in these facilities faced predetermined fates based on gender and physical characteristics. Boys showing promise were often inducted into Ottoman military or administrative systems after being separated from their mothers at age 5 or 6. Girls were evaluated for their potential as future breeding stock or domestic servants. The separation process was designed to be traumatic for mothers, serving both practical and psychological purposes. Women who lost children to imperial systems became more dependent on their captives for emotional support, a calculated strategy that reduced escape attempts and rebellion. These systematic separations created generations of people who never knew their true origins or family connections. The empire deliberately destroyed family bonds to prevent the formation of resistance networks and ensure complete loyalty to Ottoman systems. The Ottoman Empire's systematic exploitation of conquered women wasn't an aberration of medieval warfare. It was a deliberate strategy that operated for over 6 centuries, documented in the empire's own records with bureaucratic precision. These practices shaped the lives of millions, created cultural trauma that persisted for generations, and remind us how quickly civilized societies can normalize the unthinkable when power goes unchecked. The archives are there, waiting for historians willing to confront this uncomfortable truth.